In this video, I'm here to talk about the best macro settings for certain situations. Now, it would be nice if there were perfect settings that work for every photo opportunity, but that's just not the case. Starting with the basics, shutter speed, aperture, and ISO are all part of the exposure triangle, and together these three elements properly expose a shot. The shutter speed controls the duration of the exposure. For example, if you were shooting photos of stars at night, you would need to shoot at a slower shutter speed of like 10 seconds or even slower, since at night there's very limited light, and the longer your shutter is open, the more light your camera collects, which will result in a photo that's properly exposed. A faster shutter speed of 1/500th of a second or even faster is used when you're photographing fast-moving action such as birds in flight or sports. These shutter speeds will freeze the action and your subjects will still be tack sharp. The aperture controls how much light passes into the camera. A wide aperture between f2.8 and 5.6 will result in a shallow depth of field and can be helpful if you want a clean background and isolate the subject in your photos. A smaller aperture between f8 and f22 will result in a deeper depth of field in your photos and can be helpful to capture the optimum degree of fine detail in your photos. ISO is your camera's sensitivity to light. A lower ISO means less sensitivity to light, and a higher ISO means more sensitivity. Just keep in mind that the higher your ISO goes up, there will be more noise introduced to your photo. The best camera mode to shoot in my opinion, is manual mode with manual focus, because at high magnifications, autofocus will struggle and hunt for focus, which means that the camera will more than likely focus on a part of the subject that you don't want in focus. Manual mode can be a little difficult at first for beginners. A tip for getting your photos in focus is to move your camera back and forth, and you'll see your subject slowly come into focus as you move forward. If you're completely new to photography and you aren't so sure about trying manual right away, then I recommend shooting in aperture priority mode. Aperture priority gives you full control of the aperture, while the shutter speed and ISO are chosen by your camera that are based on the metering system to get the correct exposure. This is a good way to learn what will work best for you if you decide to shoot manual in the future, and also not have to worry too much about messing with your settings too much while you're in the field, because aperture priority can be pretty accurate most of the times with the exposure. Starting with the aperture, which is probably the most important out of the three, because the aperture controls the depth of field in your photos. If your goal is to show off as much detail as possible in a single shot, then I recommend setting your aperture between f8 and f14. There's usually no reason to go over f14 in my opinion. If you're a natural light shooter, it can be a little more tricky at times, but for a starting point, I recommend starting with the more open aperture of f5.6 and work your way up if necessary. It's still possible to get a good depth of field in your photos at wider apertures if you're concerned about that, but you'll probably have to focus stack to achieve it. If your goal is to take more scenic shots with more of the background involved, it's best to shoot at a wider aperture of f7.1 or under. This will eliminate a cluttered background in your photos. Shutter speed usually isn't too important if you're using a speed light flash. You can get away with slower shutter speeds of 1/30th of a second and be just fine most of the time. I usually keep my shutter speeds between 1/50th of a second and 1/250th of a second when I'm using the flash. If you're shooting without a flash, it can get a bit challenging since you don't have the extra light from a flash that'll freeze the action, but don't worry. It's still possible to achieve sharp images if you're shooting in natural light. I recommend setting your shutter speed no slower than 1/320th of a second and that's because the slightest wind or movement you make with your camera while taking photos will result in motion blur if your shutter speed is too slow. It's still possible to get away with slower shutter speeds if you're photographing a larger subject and have image stabilization, but just remember that blur is highly magnified in macro photos, so always watch this setting carefully since this is probably the most important setting for natural light shooters. With the ISO, it's usually best to shoot at the lowest ISO possible since the higher the ISO is, the more noise there will be in your photo. It's usually pretty easy with the flash to shoot with lower ISOs with no problem with the exposure. I recommend keeping your ISO between 100 and 800. For natural light shooters, it'll be really challenging shooting at lower ISOs in the range of 1 to 400 since your shutter speed will be fast. Whenever I'm shooting in natural light, my ISO range is usually between 800 and 1600. Sometimes as low as 400 on brighter days. I try not to go over 1600 when I'm shooting macro since macro photography is all about details, and more added noise can ruin the sharpness of your images. If you're new to photography, then it's best to just play around with your settings and take a lot of photos at different settings to figure out what works best for you and figure out what kind of photos you like to take. There is no right or wrong settings in any genre of photography. Just take the time to figure out what works best for you and your style of photography. If you like this video, make sure to like and subscribe for more content like this, and I'll catch y'all in the next one.